Okay, welcome back. Today for class, we're going to talk about food resources as part of a human need. We're going to focus on a couple of questions here today. These questions particularly are, what are the imbalances of food production and distribution based on political, economic, and ecological influences? And how are subsistence farms and commercial farms linked to these imbalances? So you should be able to answer these at the end of the video today. Now, if we start by looking at the food production system, food production is fairly common in most parts of the world. It usually starts with places like fishing or in the ocean. A lot of times we also produce meat or other livestock products, or we produce food out on the farm, which is going to be a lot of plants and other crops. Now, sometimes in some countries, this type of food can go from this place directly to the dinner table. But in most countries today, the food actually has to go through a process, has to go through processing and through a huge production in order to get from this point to our table. So if you follow this line here, most of our food comes into some kind of production plant or processing plant. Distribution brings it to a grocery store or possibly a restaurant. Those types of places can provide food then that gets to you at home. We've had a lot of different cereal crops. Now, cereal crops are these crops over here, like some of the more common ones are oats, or barley, or rice, or wheat. And the combination of all these crops from 1961 was that back in 1961 we were producing about 800 million metric tons of these crops, compared to today we're producing closer to 2,000 or 1,900 million metric tons of these different food crops. So even in the last 34, 35 years, the amount of these food crops has more than doubled. More than doubled. So what exactly does this mean? Well, first of all, where does this doubling happen, and how does that affect us? Well, most of these, there's no way we would really be able to double these types of crops unless we had a certain kind of farming going on. So let's take a look at the different kinds of farming that we could possibly be talking about. Now, you could imagine in a place like this. Now, on this side, this is our subsistence farm, and over here, this is our example of our commercial farm. Now, most of you could probably guess that the subsistence farm isn't necessarily doubling their production of certain crops for a few reasons you can kind of see in this picture. Most of the work is done by hand. They're raising enough food for one family. And if they're lucky, they maybe are going to grow a little bit of food to trade or sell, but it's not going to necessarily be a whole lot of that. Additionally, these types of farms might have some livestock on them. But one of the benefits of this is that it's a very little amount of livestock, and the livestock manure is used for fertilizer. As you could guess, a lot of times this happens in our less economically developed countries. Ideally, it works best in low population density areas. That means there are very few people but a lot of land. However, and unfortunately, a lot of times this is not happening in that kind of place anymore, or where this used to be happening are now often the places that have some of the quickest growing populations around the world. So one of the first things that sticks out to you in the commercial farm is that they are heavily reliant on machinery. Now, in this machinery, you can see one of the processes here, but really there's a lot of things that goes into this. So a lot of times they might go into tilling the soil, which is turning it over. They might use it to spread fertilizers. Again, if we spread fertilizers, it's simply to add nutrients to the soil. Additionally, they might use it to plant the actual plants that they're working with. Once you have the plants in place, you might use it to spread pesticides. So anytime you're trying to kill any organisms like insects or bugs or other creatures that might be living there. And then finally, as you can see up in the picture, they might use machinery for something like harvesting. Now, let's get back to this idea of what it means to actually be commercial. So a lot of times commercial farms are larger areas of land, and usually they're in the business for profit. However, a lot of farms in modern day society are not necessarily profitable. So that word might be a bit misleading in terms of looking at a commercial farm in that way. Additionally, commercial farms are trying to feed a large population. And a lot of times they are largely dependent on fossil fuels in order to run operations. Now, commercial farms also could be large livestock farms. And by livestock, we're talking about things like cows or pigs or chickens or other types of livestock that might be raised in order for a commercial profit. Now, we need to get back to these two questions about how does this style or this comparison of farming, how does it affect our influence of things that go on around the world. So to do that, we're going to look at Gapminder to look at some more of the statistics. If we take a look at Gapminder, we're going to look at two different situations. First, we're going to compare the amount of money a person makes per capita, so each person in a country. If we look at some countries like China, you can see it has a fairly low income back in 1961. The United States has a much higher income back in 1961. And again, based on the color of this, you can see that Europe, most European countries have a higher income compared to most Southeast Asian and African countries have a lower income back at this time. On this side, we're comparing it to how much cereal is being produced. So those things we mentioned before, like wheat, those types of cereals. If we watch what happens over time, the pattern that's going on here is fairly similar, where even though some countries are increasing their wheat production or their cereal production, it still is a fairly consistent pattern that countries with less money are producing less wheat and countries with more money are producing more wheat. Additionally, the size of the country might be a factor as well. So some of these really tiny countries down here like Qatar, obviously they don't have the ideal kind of place to grow the food, so we can kind of see that they aren't going to be as strongly influencing or influenced in these results. Basically though, the first thing you want to notice is that the countries here, the United States, Canada, Hungary, Australia, Denmark, France, Argentina, the Czech Republic, these are typically countries that as a whole, they have more money per person. And these countries that have more money and a lot of land are able to produce more cereal products. So how does that compare to how much food somebody actually gets? So before we said we want to make a comparison of how does your social status compare to the food distribution. And food distribution, we can say, is probably going to be based on how much money a person makes compared to how much food they actually eat. So if we take a look at this general pattern back in 1961, this kind of makes sense that if you didn't make a lot of money, like most of these African countries down here, if you didn't make a lot of money, you're not going to eat as much food. But if you do make a lot of money, like these other countries, the US, UK, Germany, a lot of European countries, you have more food. Well, as you might guess, the trend over time isn't really going to change much. That your social status or your economic status is going to be pretty consistent. There's a really obvious line here. We can see really clearly this linear pattern that goes from the most poor countries, and now even more so in Africa in 2007, and even more so in European countries and in the Americas in 2007 are getting a lot more food per person. So if we go back to our overall idea here, you can imagine a lot of these people having subsistence farms are usually poor families. They have less food per person, so their economic status is a lot less and their calorie intake is a lot less compared to the countries that are able to have commercial farms and have more money. They're going to be eating simply a lot more food. So pretty straightforward today. Hope you learned a little bit of something and hope to see you back here again sometime. Keep on learning.